This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you, Fabrice. It's a pleasure to be here this evening for this meeting of the seminar Franco-Britannique de Histoire, and thank the organizers and the conveners for this very kind invitation and their generous hospitality. In my paper today, whose title you may also see the traces of the influence of Claude Markowitz, who is present here today, in talking of the global world of Indian seafarers, I'd like to summarize my research on Indian seafarers and international merchant shipping, but also extend it in directions perhaps speaking somewhat to the interests of some of you present here today. If not entirely set at rest your doubts about what a paper on Indian seafarers in world shipping might have to do with a seminar Franco-Britannique de Histoire. Britannia is a big part of my story, but more its underside. That requires me to take you first of all to distant Indian ports and straggling Indian sailors. As some of you will already be aware, from the middle of the 19th century, British merchant vessels were being worked by a growing proportion of foreign-born crew. This proportion rose steeply in the 1870s. By 1891, more than 1 in 5 seafarers on British vessels were, to use the current term of the ILO, non-domiciled. By 1904, this proportion had risen to about 1 in 3. Since the 1850s, that is immediately following the repeal of the Navigation Acts, British shipowners led the way in instituting a global market for maritime labor. By the late 19th century, besides Southern Europe and Scandinavia, this global market had expanded to embrace ports in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. At first, British shipowners employed substantial numbers of Belgian, Dutch, German, and Scandinavian seafarers, and then soon afterwards, seafarers of Italian, Greek, Spanish, or Portuguese origin. However, from the 1880s, they began to turn to colonial seafarers, Arab, Chinese, Cypriot and Maltese, Indian, Maldivian, Malay, Sinhala, Somali, as well as crews further down the Swahili coast, West African crewmen and crews from the Caribbean islands. Britannia may have ruled the waves, but the workers of the world rode them for her. Indian seafarers were cut-price workers in this global market. Their wages, on average, about 20 to 25% of a British seaman's wage. Victualling and accommodation represented important components of labor costs on merchant ships. Employers also had to bear lower victualling and accommodation costs on account of Indian crews. Not surprisingly, therefore, Indian crews soon became the most numerous non-domiciled crews on British vessels, rising, according to some estimates, from 24,000 men, or 10% of the total crew on British vessels in 1891, to 52,000 men, or nearly 20% by 1914. The absolute numbers dropped predictably in the interwar years to some 44,000 by 1937, but as a proportion of the whole, this represented 1/3 of the total. this proportion rose further to 40%, or 2 out of 5 workers, or reportedly 60 to 62,000 men during the Second World War. The actual proportion would be higher if reckoned in terms of voyages, since Indian crews were hired for 1 or 2 years, during which they made multiple voyages, as opposed to European crews who were hired for a single voyage. The growth in the employment of Indian crews was also higher than these figures represent, especially between 1891 and 1921, because the definitions of who was an Indian seafarer narrowed considerably between these 2 years. To the best of my knowledge, this remains the earliest instance of the global offshoring of labor that we've been hearing about for some 2 decades now. Why do we see this diversification happening? Apart from lower wages, this was partly a response to the growth of maritime unionism in Britain. Masters' and officers' insecurities over the unsettling changes sweeping through merchant shipping at this time also played a role. The growth of shipping and steam propulsion created new opportunities for engineers, many from struggling middle-class families in Britain with no tradition or experience of the sea. Even on deck, because of the rapid expansion of shipping in the preceding 2 decades, younger officers felt challenged to face down older white sailors who had spent much of their lives on sailing vessels and thought nothing of the professional competence of their young deck officers. Shipping companies with heavy new investments in steam sought crewing economies at the expense of officers and engineers, who they felt were, I quote, much too expensive for the changed maritime environment, unquote. More formal norms for promotions and punishments for professional and personal offences also came into practice. The telegraph made masters more directly accountable to ship owners, enhanced the role of shipping agents at ports relative to the master and his mates, and spurred early attempts to centralize the management of tramp shipping. In turn, this often meant shorter halts at ports and longer absences from home and at sea. For masters, the diminished responsibility for the business side of shipping also meant lower commissions on cargoes and profits and diminished authority. Employing Asian, black, and colonial labor served in some degree to redress the impact of these changes on the attractiveness of merchant shipping as a career for an aspiring middle class. As a former ship's master wrote, and I quote, "Racial difference vis-a-vis the Sahib Log was a breach too wide to be easily stepped over. Indian seafarers were consequently more completely the servants of the ship owner than any other group of men doing similar work that ship owners have ever had to do work for them," unquote. The expansion of the maritime labour market beyond Europe and the North Atlantic was also enabled by the political and administrative structures of the British Empire and its strategic dependence on trade and shipping. Large ship owners with imperial interests, such as the P&O, or the Peninsular and Oriental, and Elder Dempster, pioneered or benefited disproportionately from being able to employ cheap colonial labor, and they exercised a decisive influence over imperial and colonial policies. However, as colonial policies began to promote a steady supply of cheap maritime labor, their employment extended beyond the major British shipping companies and beyond British ship owners, as the employment of Indian crews especially spread to other European and American vessels. Indian seafarers played a crucial role in keeping British shipping and external communications going. In times of peace, they helped keep British shipping, particularly tramp shipping, competitive, particularly in the eastern trades. Shipping, in turn, was a vital strategic and symbolic resource for Britain's expansive yet rapidly integrating trading empire. Consider, for example, the P&O, or the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, which was the largest employer of Indian seafarers during our period, and the imperial shipping company par excellence. The P&O received generous mail subsidies from imperial and colonial governments. As we all know, opium was the signature trade of the British Empire in 19th century Asia. By the late 19th century, the P&O came to acquire a near stranglehold of the shipping of the Bombay end of Indian opium exports to China, as also over the rock-solid custom of imperial and colonial public officials. P&O steamers have rightly been referred to as the flagships of imperialism. For some colonials, nothing kept up, and I quote, the name and influence of England in the East so surely as the sight of those splendid steamers coming and going with the regularity of clockwork, unquote. For some homesick officers and merchants in the East, there was, I quote, a feeling as of British soil about the spotless decks of the P&O. No Briton but calls himself at home when he sets foot on one of those great liners, unquote. Assembled reassuringly each morning on the deck for drills in their faux oriental costumes, lined up in picturesque costumes for tableaux vivants to relieve the monotony of the Red Sea, or assembled to play the pipe for visiting dignitaries, Indian crews on P&O boats were also exotic trophies of imperial conquest for a company that prided itself as an emblem of empire. Indian crews, Indian seafarers, also spoke to homoerotic fantasies of savage barbarians. However, barbarians domesticated in the service of a civilized yet masculine empire. And barbarians trained to keep the ship and metaphorically the empire humming whilst the master slept, and kept it in readiness for when they woke up. Naturally, therefore, Indian seafarers formed set-piece accessories in the formulaic instruction of wide-eyed yet swaggering apprentice colonialists, for whom the sea passage to India offered a stage to rehearse their pomp, bearing, and manner in anticipation of the life awaiting them in India. As Britain's grip over India began to loosen, summer cruise vessels carrying native crews offered nostalgic imperial hands and others the vicarious thrill of the empire as an enclosed theme park in the familiar waters of the North Sea. This is incidentally a social and cultural history, that is, of the emergence of leisure cruise on the North Sea with colonial cruise at the same time as elsewhere, especially on the Pacific. The cruise industry was beginning actively to produce the tropics as sites of leisure consumption. This social and cultural history has yet to be written. At other times, as during the two world wars when they died in the thousands and suffered imprisonment by the hundreds to keep its merchant fleet sailing, Indian seafarers made a difference for Britain between life and death, survival and starvation, victory and defeat. So, where did these crews sail? Pretty much to most parts of the world. And most frequently to Britain, principally London, Liverpool and Glasgow, and continental Europe, Le Havre, Marseille, Brindisi, Antwerp, Hamburg, and so on. They also sailed to the US, mainly the cotton ports along the Chesapeake Bay, New York, and Boston. Their voyages took them east, mainly to China, Japan, and Australia. More than the odd tramp steamer sailed to Pacific or South Atlantic ports or to Russia. From the 1920s, as already noted, Indian crews manned vessels diverted following the interwar slump in trade to the emerging leisure cruise industry in the North Sea. The arcs that the Indian seafarers travelled, as you can see, spanned vast spaces. But in today's paper, I shall attempt to trace the other arcs they travelled across cultural and other distances. One end of the arc, I suggest, is represented by the figure of the coolie. The emblematic coolie is familiar to us in the context of indentured labor. He or she is a figure bound by contractually imposed and legally enforced unfreedoms. However, I would invite you to consider the coolie as a more generic figure in laboring society, a mobile wage worker unstable of residence, location, and employment, possessing volitions that were unknowable, unstable, and impervious to modern methods of regulation. She had therefore to be mobilized, deployed, immobilized, and afterwards demobilized in a manner as to be available for remobilization, using apparatuses of control that were densely authoritarian even when they were not overtly penal. No matter how firmly locked into place, the coolie's imminent condition was always one of apparently random mobility. The coolie was not merely a discursive construct. He or she was also a product of colonial policies and practices, entrenching political, legal, social, and cultural apparatuses to command and immobilize wage-seeking labor. The coolie had, in short, to be made through a series of interventions by the state and employers. We are in a position to trace how exactly this happened in the maritime labor market in Calcutta port, which, along with Bombay, was one of India's two main recruitment ports for maritime labor. These interventions commenced in the late 1850s and had largely been accomplished 3 decades later. In the 1850s, Calcutta's maritime labor market drew workers from the wider Indian Ocean. Basically, this wider Indian Ocean region. From the Swahili coast to the Red Sea in the west, to Penang in the east, not to mention the Indian west coast, the Coromandel coast, the Laccadive Islands, and the Maldives. Most of these men resided near the docks in Calcutta, where they were said in police reports to live with their families. Many are even said to have owned their houses, so lived in their own homes. In short, they were an established, if not permanent presence, and not by any means a footloose or transient labor force. These men were paid a family wage, and since they were out to sea for months, their families received a regular monthly family allotment. That is, a share of the wage that would have accrued to the seafarer was given to the families every month. Ship owners hated family allotments for a number of reasons, not least because they were seen to keep wages up. In 1859, allegations of corruption in the distribution of family allotments were used by ship owners to cap their years-long campaign to have family allotments abolished. As the ship owners anticipated, the end of family allotments depressed wages, lowered the status of maritime employment, and led predictably to the dissolution and restructuring of maritime working class families and the maritime labor market in Calcutta. Increasingly dominated by extortionate and coercive intermediaries, who are called crimps in the maritime laboring context, maritime employment in Calcutta from the 1860s increasingly attracted a footloose working poor, where the new entrants unable to find any other employment, or more regular seagoing men, such as the unfortunate Panchu, an experienced seafarer who was said to divide his life between his mother-in-law's house and a prostitute's opium den, and whose personal and social life had irretrievably dissolved in the crimp's embrace. Over the next two decades, Calcutta's maritime labor market differentiated between a small, elite, but poorer group of hardcore seafarers hired to lend some spine and quality to a largely kinless mass of low-paid workers. This really begins to take effect around the mid-1880s. However, this arrangement soon became too unreliable for ship owners, because now they were increasingly having to renew their ships and invest high volumes of capital in an industry undergoing rapid technological transformation. They craved the stability of the earlier arrangements without having to incur higher labor costs. This meant drawing on new collective sources of labor supply from rural India with no historical connections with the sea. By the 1880s, this process was underway, and you can see the shift in the composition of Indian crews recruited in India between say 1880 and 1900. There were three main departments on a steamship: the deck, engine room, and the cabin. By 1910, the majority of Bombay's engine room workers came from Punjab and the northwest frontier region, hundreds of kilometers from the sea. The deck crews from Gujarat and along the Ratnagiri coast, and the cabin crews from Goa. In Calcutta, the bulk of the engine room crews came from Sylhet, deck crews from coastal Bengal, and cabin crews from Goa, as well as Calcutta proper and its suburbs. This is a pretty small map, but still this map helps show you the constrained space from within which Indian seafarers were recruited compared to, say, 30 years previously, when this is more or less their geographies of recruitment. Now, this switch from traditional seafaring crews to new seafaring crews was preceded and accompanied by discursive political and managerial projects to de-skill maritime employment, or, to put it more accurately, create a skill and skilling environment in which employers could wash their hands of any investment in skill formation or ensuring the reproduction of a stable labor force. Thus was born the modern coolie, a mediated laboring subject who could only understand traditional authority and who could therefore only be recruited, regulated, and disciplined in close accord with traditional norms and practices. So, what has all this got to do with metropolitan Britain? I am suggesting that if the coolie represented one end of this arc, the other end of the arc was represented by the maritime worker as a cosmopolitan subject in the metropole. Only this maritime worker was a disorderly and disturbing cosmopolitan presence that had to be corralled into new imperial apparatuses of tradition and identity. Yet, in corralling him into these new apparatuses, the maritime worker had to be recognized and released as a responsible subject with the potential to be a productive citizen worker, say in wartime Britain. However, recorralled into a cultural identity that prefigured the modular multicultural identity grids into which British society organized in the 1970s and the 1980s. In this sense, the arc that the Indian seafarer traversed was not only between India and Britain, coolie and cosmopolitan, but it was an arc spanning Britain and empire, social and cultural history, the colonial subject and the modern citizen, and transitions from messy colonial promiscuities to modern sterile formulas of multiculturalism. Arcs that are to some extent already familiar, as Fabris pointed out in the introduction, in the context of what has come to be described as the new imperial history. By the late 19th century, small communities of Asian and African sailors had begun to sprung up in many British dock neighborhoods. By 1914, the easy movement of colonial workers in Europe had created something approaching a continental labor market for seafarers of non-European origin that you could also see in ports like Le Havre, Marseille, Antwerp, and so on, and Hamburg, and so on. In the 1920s, conventional wisdom had it that unsociable tastes and unchanging habits made Indian seafarers incapable of relating meaningfully to their host societies. Missionaries described the social and spiritual lives of the working poor in some striking terms that actually also reflected late Victorian anxieties about urban decay and national decline. For example, Joseph Salter, a preacher at the London City Mission, described black, Asian, and other poor in London as being of animal development, a form of savage life, who had brought racial contamination and moral degradation to the very heart of a great Christian city and transformed it into haunts of depravity. He ranted against, I quote, the commingling of the worst vices of East and West in the mixed population of half castes that had sprung up in the city's port neighborhoods, unquote, and estranged them from British and Christian civilization. Quote, Christian heroism was being so conspicuously exhibited in penetrating the jungles of India and the darkest forests of Africa. Yet at the very heart of London, there existed a kind of republic, the people having all things in common, and living in holes and corners of the blind courts and alleys and recesses that were as unexplored as the depths of Central Africa, unquote. Salter's shrill denunciations are open to another reading. That is, that they traced fears and anxieties about the realities he felt mocked him every day, i.e., the sociable, life-sustaining relationships that the colonial working poor in Britain and the local working poor seemed capable of forming. Joseph Salter and his contemporaries' tropes for describing interracial slum life in late 19th century London echoed descriptions of the city's working class life in general that had been used a few decades previously. They served as prelude and drumbeat to a period when disreputable working class neighborhoods were reordered and middle class norms of housing, family, domesticity, and personal comportement found growing embodiment in a respectable working class. Against this background, Salter's denunciations may also point to anxieties about deeper interracial spaces to which some of the local working poor were being marginalized by these gentrifying projects, and a colonial working poor whose numbers were being augmented by the easy opportunities for mobility offered by seafaring. During the First World War, these processes intensified because of the large-scale mobilization of colonial troops and auxiliaries. Therefore, as Laura Tabili has noted, and I quote, "The convergence of wartime labor demands and British imperial ambitions expanded the definition of who was treated as British and to what that entitled him. The war had led to Britain becoming home to thousands of colonial seafarers and military auxiliary workers, including many in possession of British identity documents. Meanwhile, during the war, the British trade unions, especially those mobilizing seafarers, had acquired a sharp jingoistic edge, and by 1918 had begun to demand the elimination and immediate repatriation of Asiatic labor. As post-war claims on the state multiplied and new conceptions of the rights and entitlements of the British working people developed, definitions of nationality and entitlement began greatly to narrow. Within months of World War I, colonial seafarers and other workers were bundled off home, their presence now an affront to heroes demanding a home befitting the promises that had spurred them into battle. For many in the bureaucracy, colonial workers' assertion of equality with white British subjects raised questions about their real motives for going to war. Colonial workers' services, which during the war had been elicited by appeals to patriotism and celebrated as proof of the empire being one family, were now dismissed as mercenary, and any debts the survivors were owed by the empire in whose name they had fought were considered settled by timely wage payments and sacrificial offerings of white female working class flesh. In the summer of 1919, racial riots erupted in many parts of Britain to decisively problematize the presence of colonial workers for politicians, administrators, and the press. Repatriation came to appear as a natural solution. Repatriation, in turn, normalized the riots, while together they produced a racialized etiology of social conflict and a modality for resolution that would again be applied in post-Second World War Britain. The repatriation, which came as a shock to colonial soldiers and seafarers, is described by Tabili as an episode in Black Britain's struggle to maintain and assert their economic and political rights. The riots were often provoked in contexts when Asian and black workers were seen in streets associating or consorting with local white working class women. Clearly, Official and press reports of the riots reflected white male middle class anxieties about racial, gender, and imperial hierarchies. However, these same reports also disclose a parallel polycultural and potentially subversive universe of fluid and contextually negotiated norms and hierarchies of race, gender, and empire that, moreover, the riots were mobilized to disrupt. For example, the head constable of Liverpool blamed the riots, and I quote, on the arrogant and overbearing conduct, unquote, towards white men, both of the Negro population and, I quote, of the white women who cohabited with black men, unquote, and boasted to other women of the superior quality of the Negroes, unquote. For the chief constable, this meant that in nearly all cases, Negroes have been the aggressors. Women featured so prominently in the riots and in their reportage that it is hard not to read into them local officials' concerns to reassert white masculine authority over white female mobility, sociality, and sexuality after the war. At any rate, throughout the riots and afterwards, white female working class bodies became pruriently public sites on which to mock and refute black and Asian colonial men's demands as British subjects and their claims to a more inclusive citizenship. Editorial columns muttered darkly about the perils of interracial coupling, while news headlines such as "Women in Barry Negro Hunt," Barry is a place in Wales, screamed the vengeful wrath of working class Britannia. A correspondent for the Morning Post was blunt where other newspapers were sly or indirect. I quote, "You cannot give full privileges as a man and a brother to other racial types without accepting them also as brothers-in-law," unquote. Describing the sex problem as a challenge to family, community, and nation, the Western male demanded repatriation as an alternative to Jim Crow vigilantism in Britain. Some newspapers condemned white mob law, yet insisted that it was, I quote, "naturally offensive that colored men should consort with even the lowest of white women." Others who acknowledged the base ingratitude of bundling off our colored fellow subjects nevertheless thought it obvious that repatriation of a large proportion of them was desirable and inevitable. Repatriation was attractive because it represented a decisive repudiation of the debt that colonial subjects claimed for fighting Britain's war and manning its vessels. The discourse of debt repudiation takes place also in the context of finance, both after the First World War and the Second World War, as well as a project to redraw boundaries in the wake of the state's expanding social role. Powerfully reaffirming Britain's white identity, elite media and public discourses on the 1919 riots foregrounded race as a marker of working class identity and a prior qualification for citizenship. So intently was this exclusion pursued that colonial practices such as internments and concentration camps were proposed to deal with colored subjects awaiting repatriation in Britain. Though I have no evidence so far, or come across no evidence so far that there was internment or there were internment camps or concentration camps not on ships. Repatriation, of course, was easy. It was far from easy. It was resisted by the seafarers. But in the end, they also did little to ease anxieties about colonial workers in Britain or about racial and cultural contamination. These anxieties persist through the 1920s, lamenting the employment of white girls in Arab, Indian, and Maltese cafes, as an avenue for familiarity and ultimate sexual license, the Cardiff Chief Constable advocated importing the South African Immorality Act of 1927 to criminalize carnal intercourse between colored men and white women. This was 1928, by when some of these communities had become owners of cafes and even boarding houses. In the 1920s, repatriation was followed up by a series of restrictive laws and regulations on the entry and employment of colonial labor. While they were a source of great harassment to colonial workers, they were also very difficult to enforce, despite heightened police and intelligence scrutiny, which quickly became one of the most direct ways in which colonial workers came face to face with the racialization of British subjecthood. The regulations demanded new forms of identification, fingerprinting and photographs and so on, but none of these things really helped allay the anxieties of officials and bureaucrats. For example, there was a problem in identifying Chinese seafarers because no one understood how to interpret their names. The Chinese seafarers disclosed their names in the same order in which they were accustomed to doing at home? Did they change the order to accord with Western usage? Or did they switch between the two modes, whether from innocent inconsistency or deliberately in order to confuse? Did they attempt to heighten this confusion by also multiplying their spelt forms? It is well known that a Chinaman has many names. A ship's discharge might be produced in one name, spelt in 4 different forms, which its holder insists are all the same, while any consular papers may yet bear a different name. Indian and African seafarers had comparatively fewer opportunities to explore such ambiguities or experiment with new identities. Still, many attempted to elude efforts to fix their identities and preserve spaces for play, not least by modifying names and using aliases. These examples suggest that seafarers, and no doubt others in similar marginal positions, played with available markers of identities in ways that attempted to bamboozle states' efforts to fix them. They also absorbed, interpreted, and incorporated avenue experiences into their lives and persons and comported themselves in avenue ways. Take, for instance, this Allahabad seafarer Jeevan, which is a very common Hindu name. He's from the banks of the Ganges. In Cardiff, he turns up as Jiwan, J-I space W-A-N, sounding like a Chinese man. And in South Shields, you find a seafarer hanging out with Arab seafarers whose name is Wanji. So I don't know whether he's the same person, but you can see that there is this playful play with identities that is taking place. And I can multiply these examples. My paper has some of them, but I'm running short of time. In 1934, the British government decided to investigate social conditions at British ports. An investigation that was carried out by the British Council for the Welfare of the Mercantile Marine and the British Social Hygiene Council, which was formerly called the National Council for Combating Venereal Diseases. This committee wrote an alarming report, which led to dozens of parliamentary questions and demands for the appointment of a royal commission. Read by the Prime Minister of the time, no less, it declared with ringing certainty that 88%, not 87, not 89, 88% of venereal disease infections at Cardiff Port came from abroad. And that over half the cases of venereal disease in the mining villages and towns around Cardiff, 54% to be exact, were contracted in the so-called cafes in Booth Street, in the port neighborhood of Cardiff. The committee asserted that colonial seafarers were attracted to Britain by a life of idleness and comparative wealth that unemployment benefits offered. They arrived in London rapidly. Their numbers in London were rising rapidly, weekly by the hundreds, and the police themselves are unable to estimate their numbers. The newcomers, the report insisted, could not be expected to adopt a standard of civilization and moral codes that they could be expected to understand. The report warned of the indiscriminate mating between colonial workers and the type of British women willing to accept them, that is, women of loose moral character. These are all quotes. Who felt no inhibition about bringing a half-caste population into the world. Outraged and incoherent, the committee sought to equate interracial partnerships with prostitution by reproducing stereotypes about Indian and Negro seamen being more attractive to the prostitutes than aliens and British seamen. I quote, "Once a girl has been in company with a colored man, she seems to prefer them to other types of seamen," unquote. There was now, therefore, a vicious circle. Quote, "Even if the colored population were not still increasing, there were enough mixed couples in the dock areas of London, Liverpool, and Cardiff to produce hundreds more of this unfortunate half-caste population as each year passes." These fears intensify, patriarchal anxieties of a colored male invasion, rampant indigenous female sexuality and miscegenation and so on throughout the 1930s. A 1939 report, for instance, deplored the welcomed the decline of open prostitution near ports, but deplored the less visible and growing evil of, I quote, "young girls who would resent being regarded as prostitutes, loitering near seamen's boarding houses in search, amongst other things, of permanent illicit relationships," unquote. So this, in the opinion of this 1939 committee, this problem had burst the bounds of dock neighborhoods and ports, was now becoming a wider working class problem. These anxieties are intensified further during the Second World War in the wake of the increase in the population of colonial workers. Fears of racial mixing deepened, with one of the several Home Office conferences on the subject affirming that, I quote, "For social reasons, the presence of these men in such large numbers was undesirable," unquote. Social anxieties were reinforced by fears of political subversion, especially because of the growing Indian anti-colonial nationalist movement. In retrospect, the sheer amount of time, energy, and attention that the highest levels of racialized police and bureaucracy expended on colonial workers during the war was not only out of proportion to their numbers, it also places in curious relief the conventional view of wartime Britain and of the empire as a society mobilized for total war against an overwhelming racialist external enemy. However, the war led to a parallel development, which is the emergence of a kind of social research, particularly by neighborhood civil society organizations. Revealing precocious traces of some new modalities for representing and regulating racial and cultural difference. Such research helped uncover buried genealogies of modern multiculturalism and the anxieties for which it appeared to offer resolutions. Pre-war and wartime investigations of the colonial working class presence had one feature in common, that is the stigmatization of interracial partnerships. But wartime social research brought another tendency more overtly to the fore, namely of blaming and shaming female working class sexuality as being at the root of the problem, and rendering colored workers as respectable but lonely men liable to easy entrapment. These divergent premises pointed also to differences in approach and solutions. For example, while the 1930s committees suggested racial exclusion, social segregation, repatriation, and immigration controls, a committee in the 1940s professing concern for the needs of this real and permanent section of British social life demanded the disciplining of the women who were flocking to London dock neighbourhoods, chasing these men from all parts of Britain. Because these men possessed charming manners and great gentleness, lacking in most white working class men. They made good husbands and fathers. They were reliable, self-supporting people who disliked applying for official help. Could contrast it to the 1930s when these people were welfare sloths. The problem was that their mooring in traditional moral values and social mores were undone by their loneliness and superstition, which forced these Asian and African men to freely enter into sexual relationships with white women. So they were traditional, they were superstitious. Now these traditions and superstitions, which had held them in check at one stage, were now pushing them into sexual relationships with white women. So the committee reserved its harshest scorn for such women. They flocked from other ports and towns in order to trade on colored men. I quote, and some of the quotes are pretty lurid, having failed to achieve real satisfaction in life, they sought it through sex and the easy acquisition of material things, and forfeited all moral sense in their desperate anxiety to achieve their objects. Unquote. These women, I quote, were outcast from society and had no use for its rules. Unquote. They abused the colored men's inherent decency and longing for love and family to plunge them into a moral, emotional, cultural, and legal abyss. I would like to suggest that this evidence I read as evidence for the presence of a precocious but embattled subaltern cosmopolitan sociality lasting at least through the interwar years. These forms of sociality do not figure in histories of multiculturalism, whether conventional or critical. Prone to viewing minorities only as victims of racial and other forms of discrimination, multiculturalist histories largely neglect the resistant lives of cosmopolitan sociality that mixed communities on the margins of state and society improvised. Attending to these lives, their stories, and the deep anxieties they provoked among the dominant classes and social groups may point us beyond currently authorized tropes of difference and genealogies of multiculturalism, and beyond the scholarship to exploring to what extent multiculturalist projects were premised on a prior racial, cultural, and gender reordering of Western societies to regulate disorderly subaltern sociality and white female sexuality. In conclusion, I would like to suggest that the arcs traversed by Indian seafarers from being coolies to disorderly cosmopolitan subjects help restore the jagged and contested history of British multiculturalism to its proper colonial and imperial context. Doing so not only reveals new dimensions of well-recognized modalities of colonial and metropolitan governance and their interconnections, it also restores authoritarian male classist norms and attitudes to histories of modern European multiculturalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you.